Everybody in the mountains knows the name, Tom Dooley. There's an old ballad about him that spread through these hills for nearly 100 years. Millions of people heard that song, but what really happened in those mountains in 1866, the disease, the grave, the soaking wet shoes, the secret a woman carried to her grave, none of that is in the song. Never was. Picture a wooden wagon creaking down the dirt road into Statesville. Thousands of people lined the road. Curious ones, angry ones, and some who couldn't have told you why their eyes were wet. And that man, lean, dark-haired, 22 years old, stared straight ahead without crying, without begging. What he said on that wagon and what he signed with his own hand the night before are two things that don't add up. And it's exactly that gap in the middle of this story that's going to hold you till the end. But to understand what really happened, you need to understand what that corner of the world looked like 3 years before. Because this story doesn't start with a crime. It starts with a war. The American Civil War ended in April of 1865. And if you think the end of a war means the beginning of peace, you never saw what gets left behind when the shooting stops. What came back to these hillsides of North Carolina wasn't peace. It was silence, the kind of silence that settles in after you've lost what little you had. Fields nobody farmed right anymore. Cabins with holes in the walls nobody patched. Women raising children alone because their husbands never came home, or came home with pieces missing on the inside that no eye could see. The Yadkin Valley, cutting through the northwest of North Carolina, was a place divided in two. Down on the flat land near the river, you had the families with money, with names, with property. Up on the ridges and hillsides above lived another kind of people, poor, proud, and running by their own rules, which were mighty different from the ones the world down below lived by. The New York Herald years later would describe these mountain folk as living in a state of poverty and desperation that few places in the country could match. Tom Dooley was that kind of people, and he went to fight with nothing to lose but his own life. Thomas Dooley was born in 1845, somewhere in the hills around the Yadkin Valley. When the war came, he was maybe 16, 17 years old. Old enough to be scared, but not old enough to know he ought to refuse. He joined the 42nd Regiment of North Carolina Infantry as a volunteer. He fought well. His own regiment brothers confirmed that years later inside a courtroom. In 1865, Tom Dooley came home. He stood 5 feet 11 inches tall, dark curly hair, dark eyes, and carried himself in a way people described as striking without being exactly handsome. He was 22 years old, and he came back to a valley the war had left even poorer, even more closed off, even more given over to its own ways. What happened after he set foot in that valley didn't fit in a song. Couldn't. A few miles up from where the Dooleys lived, there was a man named James Melton, a shoemaker, successful by the standards of those mountains. He had a cabin, steady work, and a wife named Anne, who was considerably younger than him and wasn't particularly interested in being a shoemaker's wife. Anne Melton. Before the war even started, when Tom Dooley was still a boy of 16, he was already sharing her bed. with James Melton's knowledge. Lottie Foster, Anne's mother, was one of the people who saw the two of them together in that room. Tom scrambling out of bed, still without his clothes, when she walked in unannounced. James Melton slept on the other side of the cabin, alone. You might be wondering what kind of man allows that under his own roof. The honest answer is, we don't rightly know. That arrangement existed. It worked in its crooked way that only made sense inside those walls. And when Tom came back from the war in 1865, he went straight back to Anne Melton's bed, as if 4 years of battle had been nothing more than a long work trip. James Melton's cabin was small, one single room, 3 beds, and a set of unspoken agreements that nobody from the outside could ever hope to understand. What's important for you to know about Anne Melton is that she was no passive figure in this story. From the testimony given at trial, she was possessive, jealous, and capable of a kind of anger that the people around her learned to respect over time. When she wanted something, she got it. When she wanted somebody quiet, they went quiet. You'll understand the weight of that soon enough. Tom, for his part, didn't stay only at the Melton place. He visited other houses, other people. And these mountains are small. Everybody knows everybody else's steps, even when they pretend not to. It was around this time that Tom started frequenting another house. Across Elk Creek, which ran as the dividing line between Wilkes County and Caldwell County, lived Wilson Foster and his daughter, Laura. In March of 1866, a young woman named Pauline Foster showed up at James Melton's cabin looking for work as a hired hand. Pauline was a distant cousin of Anne Melton. She came from Watauga County over in Tennessee, and she brought with her something nobody had bargained for: syphilis. It's not clear whether Pauline knew exactly what she was carrying when she arrived. What she said at trial years later is that she came seeking treatment, that she wanted to earn enough money to buy medicine. But what she found at the Melton cabin was a situation nobody on the outside would call normal. Tom Dooley was there nearly every day, slept there sometimes, and the 3 beds in that single room rarely had the same occupants 2 nights running. The disease passed to Tom. Tom passed it to Anne. But here's the thing, and it's the thing that sets everything else in motion. Tom didn't know Pauline had arrived already sick. What he knew, or believed he knew, was that he'd started showing symptoms a few months after being with Laura Foster across Elk Creek. The arithmetic in his head was simple, and it was wrong. He blamed Laura. Dr. Carter, who treated Tom in early 1866, confirmed at trial that Tom himself had told him he caught the disease from Laura Foster on a ridge less than a mile from Lottie Foster's house months before. Tom believed it, and by mid-May, he told a neighbor he'd spoken to after a church service that he was diseased and aimed to make whoever had infected him pay for it. That neighbor told him he wouldn't do that if he were him. Tom didn't answer. That remark sat inside a man who was called to testify in a murder trial 2 years later. Because sometimes what sounds like idle talk on a dirt road turns out to be the first piece of a criminal case. It was Thursday, May 26, 1866. Tom Dooley went to Lottie Foster's house, Anne Melton's mother, and asked to borrow a mattock, a heavy digging tool used for breaking and clearing ground. He was asked what he needed it for. Tom said he wanted to work some devilment out of himself. Nobody found that strange enough to press further. A woman who lived nearby saw him that same day or the day before. The sources don't line up exactly on the date, walking the path between the Dooley place and Lottie Foster's, swinging the mattock along the side of the trail. She asked what he was doing. He said he was widening the path so he could move along it easier at night. The spot where she saw him was 200 to 300 yards from where a body would be found weeks later. That same Thursday afternoon, Anne Melton left the cabin with a canteen of liquor that had been filled at Tom's request. She said she was going to visit her mother. She didn't come back until the early hours of Friday morning, with her dress wet and her shoes soaked through. She lay down in Pauline's bed without a word. Pauline let her sleep. Friday morning, early, Tom appeared at the cabin, found Anne still in bed. He leaned over her, talking low. Pauline was in the house, but stepped out to milk the cows. When she came back, Tom was already gone. Laura Foster left home that same Friday morning before daylight. Her father, Wilson Foster, woke to find his daughter gone and the mare that had been tied up outside gone with her. He followed the mare's tracks, recognizable by a horseshoe he'd started trimming himself but hadn't finished, with a sharp edge that left a distinctive mark in the dirt. The tracks led toward the Bates place, an abandoned piece of land a few miles off. The mare came back on her own the next day. Laura never did. There's a detail about Wilson Foster that's hard to swallow. During cross-examination at trial, it came out that he had said, at some point during the search, that if he could get his mare back, he didn't much care what had happened to his daughter. He denied saying it on the stand, but the fact that someone felt the need to ask about it at all says something about the world Laura Foster was living in. A neighbor woman saw Laura that morning riding her father's mare bareback, a bundle of clothes in her lap. She asked if Mr. Dooley had come. Laura said yes, that he'd arrived just before daylight, that they were meeting at the Bates place. Tom was seen by at least 4 different people that morning, walking on foot in the same direction. Carlton spotted him just after sunrise, cutting through his yard and asking whether the path led to Kendall's. Mr. Kendall saw him around 8 in the morning, heading the same way. His pants were wet with dew. He was seen again after breakfast at a neighbor's house, walking, turning down an invitation to come inside. Each witness placed Tom at a different point at time intervals that fit together like clockwork. All heading the same direction, all moving away from the Bates' place afterward. Nobody saw Laura after that morning. The weeks that followed were weeks of searching. The neighbors organized themselves into lines, like battle lines, the same formations many of them had learned during the war. They combed every hillside, every thicket, every creek bed. They searched within sight of Tom Dooley's house. Tom never once showed up to help. A few weeks after the disappearance, someone found a rope tied around a dogwood tree 75 yards off the main road, deep in the brush. The ends matched the ends of the rope Wilson Foster used to tie his mare. He'd braided it himself. It was the same rope that had vanished with Laura that Friday morning. The smell came before the discovery. Isbel and his father-in-law were working a ridge when one of their horses snorted and started pawing at the ground with its nose down. They probed the earth with sticks and found a patch where the soil had been removed and replaced with sod. After half an hour of careful searching, they found the grave, 2.5 feet deep, narrow, too short for a grown woman's body. Laura's legs were drawn up because whoever dug that hole hadn't planned for the right length. Beside the body was a bundle of clothes. The clothes were identified by her father. The teeth, large with a natural gap in the center, were identified by those who had known her. The shoes had a hole in the side, and they were shoes James Melton had made. Isabel noticed something else in that hole. On the hard-packed walls of the grave, there were marks, mattock marks. The wound on Laura's body was below her left breast, between the third and fourth ribs, a stab wound. The doctor couldn't confirm whether it had pierced the heart. The body was too far decomposed, but he said that if the blade had gone in at a slight angle, it would have cut the heart clean through. Pauline Foster had gone to Tennessee for a spell around that time. When she came back, a friend asked her in a joking way whether she'd left because she'd killed Laura Foster. Pauline answered, also seemingly in jest, that she and Tom Dooley had killed Laura together. 2 or 3 days later, she was in jail. With her freedom on the line, Pauline told what she knew, and what she knew was enough to lead investigators to the right ridge. What Pauline described was that Anne Melton knew where the body was. On a day after Tom was already locked up, Anne led Pauline out to that ridge. They went by Lottie Foster's place, crossed an old field, climbed up to a fallen log on a crest. There, Anne gathered up an apron full of leaves and placed them over a patch of ground that looked to have been disturbed. 100 yards from where they stood was Laura's grave. Pauline got frightened and refused to go any further. They turned back. After that, Anne went to a neighbor's house and told her to let everything that had happened die as a secret. Said she'd follow Pauline to hell if she talked. Said only 4 people had heard any of it, and she'd know exactly where it came from if it ever got out. When Pauline was confronted with all of this later, in a physical fight with Anne at that same neighbor's house, she said something that went into the trial record. "You know you're as deep in this mud as I am." Anne told her she was a liar. 2 or 3 weeks before Tom left for Tennessee, James Melton had mentioned in front of him that word was going around that Dooley had killed Laura Foster. Tom heard it and laughed, said they'd have to prove it, and that they might catch a beating for trying. This was the same man who'd be running through Tennessee under a different name just weeks later. Sometimes arrogance and fear ride together in the same chest. The night before he left, Tom came back to James Melton's cabin. Pauline Foster described that night at trial with the kind of detail that only comes from someone who lived it close. Tom arrived after dark with a look she described as troubled. James Melton came in shortly after. Pauline offered Tom a bed. He refused, threw himself across a bed fully dressed, didn't even take off his shoes. Anne lay down on the bed beside him. The cabin went quiet for a while. Then Pauline heard the two of them sobbing. Tom got up and went to the bed where Anne was. Anne rose and went outside. He followed. They were out there for a time. When they came back in, Tom lifted the head of Pauline's bed and told her to come out, that he was going to tell her what was going on. Outside in the dark, he told her they were spreading lies about him. They held each other, parted in tears. The next morning, Tom Dooley left for Tennessee. That same afternoon, after Tom was gone, Anne Melton did something that Pauline Foster described at trial, and that has never had a clear explanation. Anne went to the head of the bed, pried a board off the wall of the cabin, cleared the dirt from the gap behind it, punched a hole through the chinking with her bare hands, drove a nail into the log on the outside of the wall, ran a string through the hole, tied one end to the nail, laid the other end inside the bed. Then she slid a knife under the mattress. Pauline watched all of it, didn't ask a word, or at least never left any record that she did. To this day, nobody knows for certain what it meant. Was it some kind of alarm in case someone approached the cabin at night? Fear of a specific person? Something that only made sense to Anne? The trial record describes the act with precision and offers no explanation whatsoever. That absence is, perhaps, the most unsettling thing in this entire story. A woman building something secret inside her own wall on the afternoon the man she loved disappeared for good. Tom Dooley was found in Pandora, Tennessee, working on the farm of a man named Colonel Grayson. When he realized the authorities were closing in, he ran from that farm too. Grayson organized the search party and talked him into giving himself up. Grayson. That name shows up in the song years later, but shaped into something completely different. Doc Watson, the musician from these North Carolina mountains, whose own family lived alongside the people in this story, said that Grayson was deeply jealous of Tom. Said Grayson knew Tom hadn't committed the crime. Whether that's true or not isn't in the official record. What is in the record is that it was Grayson who led the search, persuaded Tom to surrender, and brought him back. Tom came back and stood trial. The case drew enough attention that a heavy name stepped in for the defense. Zebulon Vance, former governor of North Carolina, offered his services free of charge. Vance believed, according to what was recorded, that Tom was shielding the woman who had actually committed the crime. But Tom never talked. Vance and his legal team are said to have packed the jury with Confederate war veterans and kept Tom's war record front and center throughout. The trial was moved to Iredell County to keep local prejudice from tainting the outcome. It began on October 19, 1866. Nearly 5 months after Laura's disappearance, 3 months after the body was found. The national papers covered every detail. The New York Herald painted the Yadkin Valley as a place of unmatched immorality in pages read across the country. Sensationalism, sure enough. But people couldn't get enough of it. Tom and Anne were tried separately. The witnesses came one by one. The neighbors who'd seen Tom that Friday morning, the doctor who'd treated him for syphilis, Wilson Foster describing how he'd recognized his daughter's body by her teeth and her clothes. Pauline Foster was the prosecution's most important witness and the most attacked by the defense, which tried to show she'd said publicly that she would lie any time for Tom Dooley. In the end, the jury came back with a verdict of guilty. Tom appealed to the Supreme Court of North Carolina. A new trial was granted. The second trial came back the same way. Anne Melton, tried separately, was acquitted. One of the jurors, according to what was later documented, reportedly said she was too pretty to hang. On the night of April 30th, 1868, the last night of his life, Thomas Dooley picked up a pen and wrote in his own hand, "I declare that I am the only person who had a hand in the murder of Laura Foster." He signed it. The next morning, May 1st, 1868, he was taken to the place of execution in Statesville. Several thousand people were there. He made a long address from the gallows, spoke of readiness for another world, of peace with what was coming. And then, just before the rope was placed around his neck, he looked at it and said it was so clean and well made that he reckoned he ought to have washed his neck. That was the last minute of a man convicted of murder. Make of that what you will, but what Doc Watson carried down through the oral memory of these mountains is different from what the newspapers printed. Doc Watson said Tom made one last declaration of innocence while sitting on his coffin in the wagon on the way to the hanging. That men about to die rarely hold to a story when it can no longer protect anyone. You've got a written confession on one side, an oral tradition of innocence on the other. And between the two, there's no answer clear enough to say with any certainty which one is the truth. Tom was hanged at 2:17 in the afternoon on that first day of May. After the hanging, his body was taken back to his home, thrown onto his bed, and left there bleeding on the floor. No ceremony, no immediate burial. A man who had served in the 42nd Regiment of North Carolina Infantry, whom fellow soldiers had called brave and honest, treated that way at the end. You draw your own conclusions about what that says. He was buried. The case closed. Anne Melton lived 6 more years after Tom's hanging. She died in 1874. The sources don't agree on the cause. Some say a carriage accident, others say complications from the syphilis she'd been carrying for years. She maintained her innocence until the end. But on her deathbed, she was tended to by a woman named Betsy Triplett Watson, Doc Watson's great-grandmother. Anne told Betsy that if she was sure she wasn't going to recover, she had something to say about Tom Dooley's hanging. But as long as there was any chance she might pull through, she didn't dare speak it. She died without saying it. To this day, it's not clear from the historical record whether Tom Dooley killed Laura Foster alone, whether he killed her with Anne Melton's help, or whether Anne was the one who struck the blow while Tom covered the tracks. A woman stood trial, was acquitted because she was too pretty to hang, and carried the secret to her grave. A man signed a confession on the last night of his life that may have been the truth, or may have been one final act of loyalty from someone who spent his whole life protecting the people he loved. The song started circulating through these mountains before Tom was even hanged. For nearly 100 years, it was the kind of song you heard on porches, around fires, on slow Sunday afternoons, passed mouth to mouth through the Carolina backcountry, while the world down below never knew it existed. In 1958, the Kingston Trio recorded it, and it climbed to #1 on the charts. The words are simple, just a few lines that everybody in these mountains already knew by heart. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, hang down your head and cry. Hang down your head, Tom Dooley, poor boy, you're bound to die. If you want to hear it the way it was meant to sound, it's right there on YouTube. Just search Tom Dooley Kingston Trio. I can't play it for you, copyright and all that, but it's worth a listen after everything you just heard. Millions of people heard that song. Not one of them knew about Pauline Foster, the syphilis, the mattock, the hard-packed walls of that grave, or Anne's soaking wet shoes on that Friday morning. When these mountains can't settle a story, they turn it into music, and the music kept on, carried by mouth for nearly 100 years, until it finally climbed down off these mountains and found everybody else. But the secret stayed up here with Anne, and with whoever's still not sure after all this that Tom Dooley told the whole truth that night. If you made it this far, I reckon you're the kind of person who appreciates a story told right. There's plenty more where this came from. Stories from these mountains that never made it into any history book. If you want to hear them, subscribe. Won't cost you a thing, and I'll be right here when you come back.